Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 293, Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland is almost here. It goes down on September 9th in Australia. And I wish I could tell you this card was phenomenal. I wish I could tell you, oh, this pay-per-view is absolutely stacked. But the truth is, UFC 293 is an absolute embarrassment. It is a slap in the face to MMA fans as a whole, and it's also a slap in the face in a club in Mexico at 53 years old to all the Australian fans who bought tickets to go to this event live with the fight card sight unseen. And I know there have been injuries. We're going to talk about those fights in this video, but the main event, Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland, I feel like it could have been done so much better, but the UFC just made a series of mistakes in decision-making that ended up with what we ended up at UFC 293. And I wanted to make a video talking about this absolute of an embarrassment of a card. Now, before we even get into the main card, which believe me, we're going to get into the main card because it is atrocious, I want to look at the prelims, because the prelims sometimes the UFC puts really good fights on the prelims. For whatever reason, they're building it a certain way because it's going to be on ESPN or ABC. And sometimes there's fights that should be on the pay-per-view that are on the prelims instead. So let's briefly look over the prelims. And I'm not going to go through every single fight. I'm only going to point out the very notable prelims. And you look at the prelims, Jamie Mullarkey versus John McDessie. Is there anyone excited for that fight at all? Let me know down in the comments. Seriously, is there anyone excited for that fight at all? I think they're both coming off losses. Shane Young versus Gabriel Miranda. I'm pretty sure Shane Young's on a 3-fight losing skid. I mean, who even cares about that fight? Now, I do want to point out this. You have Jack Jenkins versus Chepe Mariscal. That's a super low-level fight, but it should be an absolute barn burner. And Chepe Mariscal, he's maybe a hair above low level. He's crazy, wild striker, brawler. That should be a banger of a fight. But again, it's very low level, but I have to give him credit for that prelim. That's great matchmaking by the UFC. I'm really looking forward to seeing Jack Jenkins versus Chepe Mariscal, even though I think Jack Jenkins lost his last fight. Now also, and this isn't in any particular order, they got Blood Diamond on the prelims. Oh my God, they got Blood Diamond. What a cool name, Blood Diamond. He's literally a garbage can. The only reason he's still in the UFC, and the only reason he got to the UFC in the first place, was because he's friends and trains with Israel Adesanya. So don't care about that fight. Oh, the only other notable prelim, and really now I've gone through basically the entire prelims outside of Nasrat Haqparast versus Landon Quinones, which he's making his UFC debut. Nasrat Haqparast has basically been at the bottom of the lightweight weight class for many years. But the only other notable prelim is Carlos Ulberg versus Da Ung Jung, and they're basically just setting up Carlos Ulberg to go out there and get an easy win. That's what they're doing. They're building Carlos Ulberg into a contender in the division. That is all they're doing. So the prelims, there's nothing like sometimes like, you know, back at, I don't remember which event it was supposed to be at now. I think it was UFC 290. We were supposed to get Jack Della Maddalena versus Sean Brady, and that was a banger of a prelim. There's really none of those on this card. There's no real super relevant fights to the division on the prelims. I mean, not necessarily the entire card, the prelims of this card. It's just garbage prelim after garbage prelim with one really good banger of a wild brawl type fight between Jack Jenkins and Chepe Mariscal, which I'm actually really excited for that fight, even though, again, it's kind of low level. And then you get to the main card. Actually, before we even get to the main card, I know a lot of people are going to kind of excuse it away. Oh, it's injuries, Joey, it's injuries, the injury bug. There's actually been 2 official injury cancellations for UFC 293. One is Viviane Araújo versus Casey O'Neill. Casey O'Neill pulled out of the card with an injury. Who cared about that fight? Don't get me wrong, that was an okay fight that made it, you know, 0.1% better. But at the end of the day, that's not some massive fight. Now, this next fight that was canceled just recently really hurt the card badly. And that is Kai Kara France versus Manel Kape. I was really looking forward to that flyweight fight. Kai Kara France pulled out, had a concussion, can't make the card. That's super disappointing because honestly, that's a fight for a potential #1 contender spot in the division. Bare minimum, their next fight's going to be for #1 contender spot. So Manel Kape versus Kai Kara France getting canceled actually really did hurt the card. Now, Manel Kape is staying on the card. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's super unfortunate to already have a card that leaves a lot to be desired, and then you lose one of the only good fights on the card. And in my opinion, Manel Kape versus Kai Kara France, was the second best fight on the card outside of the main event, which we're going to talk about in a second, which I don't even like the main event all that much, but that's how bad this card is. So if you look at the actual main card, okay, because those are the only two official fight cancellations, we're going to talk about another one that was kind of alluded to but never was actually announced. But you have opening up the main card right now. They may change this order around a little bit. You have Manel Kape versus Felipe Dos Santos. Felipe Dos Santos is 7-0, making his UFC debut. Now, don't get me wrong. We see guys make their UFC debut and come out and surprise you. We've seen recently Steve Erceg versus David Dvorak. But at the end of the day, most likely Manel Kape is going to slaughter Felipe Dos Santos. I haven't seen a lot of his fight tape. He's new to the UFC. He's only 7-0. But let's be honest, Manel Kape is very, very good. He's had a full training camp for this fight. He was supposed to fight Kai Kara France. He has nasty power. He's super well-rounded. Most likely, Manel Kape's going to destroy him. So now we have a fight where Manel Kape is close to a title shot. What's he going to beat? A guy making his UFC debut to get a title shot now? So it almost renders that fight meaningless. Now, don't get me wrong, that could still be a decent fight. But nonetheless, it's a far cry from the Kape versus Kai Kara France fight. Now, you move up the card. We have Tyson Pedro versus Anton Turkalj. Literal garbage fight. Tyson Pedro's coming off that loss to Modestas Bukauskas. Anton Turkalj's coming off, I think he's on a 2-fight losing streak. He's not very good, not all that good. Came off of Dana White's Contender Series. Who cares about this fight? This fight is by no means main card caliber whatsoever. Then the next fight up the card, this is actually kind of main card caliber, but really should be like a headliner of the prelims. You have Justin Tafa versus Austin Lane. Now, they fought a couple months ago, but the fight ended with an eye poke. Justin Tafa got eye poked, could not continue. We really didn't get to see the fight play out at all. That's a decent heavyweight fight. Don't get me wrong. That's a decent heavyweight fight. I'm curious to see how Austin Lane can compete with some of these heavyweights. But at the end of the day, I mean, this should be opening up the main card bare minimum. And if this fight goes past the first round, I think this is going to be a very, very sloppy fight. So this fight genuinely belongs like headlining the prelims or bare minimum opening up the main card. Now, the next fight you have up, because that was actually the featured fight on the card, the co-main event. You have Tai Tuivasa versus Alexander Volkov. Don't get me wrong, I like watching Tai Tuivasa fight, but this is the co-main event. Tai Tuivasa is coming off a loss to Sergey Pavlovich and Cyril Gane. You have Alexander Volkov, who's doing all right now. He's on a 2-fight winning streak. Alexander Romanov and Jairzinho Rozenstruik. This is not co-main event on a big pay-per-view card worthy at all. I'm interested in this fight. This is a decent fight. Don't get me wrong. Tai Tuivasa is very fun to watch. I get it. His whole entire personality is drinking alcohol out of dirty shoes that he spits in. But nonetheless, this is not co-main event material. This really doesn't belong as a co-main event. And what sucks about this card in general, outside of all these fights, and we're going to go to the main event in 1 second, I feel like they could have found some better fights. How could they not find an opponent for Jack Della Maddalena on a month's notice, a month and a half's notice since Jack Della Maddalena last fought? Instead, he's fighting Kevin Holland. I think it's on September 16th or September 23rd, a week or two after this fight. You're getting Kevin Holland versus Jack Della Maddalena. They couldn't find a way to get him on this card. They couldn't find a way to put some other quality fights on this card. The fact that we're getting Tai Tuivasa versus Alexander Volkov, I'm dead serious. Jack Della Maddalena versus Kevin Holland would have been a more suitable co-main event. I don't know who's making these decisions. And I understand we had a lot of fight cards in July. I understand we had a lot of fight cards, okay? And I understand they used a lot of talent. But the fact they can't plan better to make a better event for the Australian fans. The UFC, just to give you some context, the UFC signed a deal with the Australian government to bring these events there. And the Australian government is paying the UFC because of the economic impact that a UFC event has there. They are paying them to bring a card there. And the UFC shows up with this. I would cancel that deal immediately. This is a horrible card. The co-main event, Tai Tuivasa, Alexander Volkov. That is crazy to me. Then you have the main event, Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland for the middleweight title. I hate this fight. I've already talked about it ad nauseum. I hate it. It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. Sean Strickland coming off of 2 wins, one over Nasruddin Imavov, the other one over Abus Magomedov, okay? An unranked guy. And don't get me wrong, I think Abus Magomedov was good. I saw a situation where Sean Strickland could potentially get the next title shot. But the UFC, a lot of people were using this expression when describing Francis Ngannou. They said Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag, which he did not. He ended up signing one of the biggest contracts in heavyweight history, actually the biggest contract in heavyweight history. But nonetheless, I think the UFC fumbled the bag with this, because you look back and what this main event really truly should have been. It should have been Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis. And I know somebody's going to be down in the comments saying, Dricus du Plessis was injured. Dricus du Plessis didn't want to make the quick turnaround. I understand that. The UFC knew this event was happening since May. They knew this event was happening since May. So the UFC could have easily either not made Dricus du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker. I understand, and that fight would have lost a little bit of luster, considering then Dricus du Plessis wouldn't have the win over Robert Whittaker. But at the same time, they could have made the Dricus du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker fight a little bit earlier. They could have made it a couple weeks earlier. They could have made it a month earlier. They could have put it on UFC 289. I know, okay, there's scheduling conflicts and stuff like that. But if the UFC planned, which we know they did because Dana White announced Robert Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis is a #1 contender fight, and they knew Adesanya was most likely headlining at 293 in Australia in early September, they should have put 2 and 2 together. Okay, whoever wins that fight might not want to make an 8-week turnaround. So the UFC, instead of making the decisions ahead of time to be able to make this fight happen at UFC 293, they said, okay, we'll just risk it. And now we're not getting Adesanya versus du Plessis, and that fight may never happen. I did an entire video about that if you care to check it out. I'll link it down in the description. But now this fight may never happen. And at the end of the day, we have roughly, a month and a half between UFC 293 and UFC 294. They could have easily scheduled UFC 293. And again, I say easily, but I don't know the exact logistics with the stadium or the arena, whatever. I don't know the exact logistics, but they could have found a way to make UFC 293 maybe the end of September. And then they could have booked Robert Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis maybe mid-June. And then you would have had a larger amount of time to be able to get the winner of Whittaker versus du Plessis to have a turnaround and have the Adesanya versus du Plessis fight, which is the fight the fans truly wanted. That's the true #1 contender of the middleweight division fighting the champion. But instead, we get Sean Strickland. Now, don't get me wrong. Sean Strickland is a good fighter. He's a very good fighter. He's even an underrated fighter. But at the end of the day, Sean Strickland, the chances of him beating Israel Adesanya are slim and none. He might get it done. We've seen bigger upsets happen. But on paper, in terms of excitement level, Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis is a far better matchup than Adesanya versus Strickland. Strickland likes to just pump the jab and throw combinations and kind of just plot forward. And we know Adesanya, when he has an opponent that isn't very aggressive, Adesanya will just kind of point and fight from range. So if you had this main event, we've seen it plenty of times before where the UFC will put a lackluster main event similar to Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland, at least stack the card underneath of it. How did they not make the proper calculations to be able to throw some solid fights on UFC 293? All these Australian fans, which I really feel bad for, they got really scammed. A lot of them bought tickets sight unseen. They bought tickets to UFC 293. Dana White's promising, we're going to bring a banger of a card for you to Australia. We're going to bring this amazing card. And then they show up with this. There's literally one good prelim. And then you look at the main card, there's really one decent fight, and that's Israel Adesanya versus Sean Strickland. And again, I know I just crapped all over that fight, but I'm just saying people are still going to be interested in seeing Israel Adesanya defend his middleweight title, and Sean Strickland's still a high-level fighter, but at the end of the day, he doesn't even deserve a title shot. And I know there's really no other options for the middleweight division to fight on this exact date, but they should have figured this out ahead of time. And this is just compounding by horrible decisions with the UFC with other title fights of undeserving contenders. It's like we're getting undeserving title fight after undeserving title fight after undeserving title fight. 2023 is the beginning of the UFC really heading down a slippery slope of becoming closer to WWE. And I don't think Adesanya versus Strickland is the best example of this. And I might actually make another video on this because you got John Jones versus Stipe. You got supposedly Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. You have the potential O'Malley versus Cheeto 2 fight potentially getting made in December, which all are fights where you have basically undeserving title challengers. If you want that video, if you want that dedicated video, let me know down in the comments. But UFC 293, as it sits right now, and I mean, this seems like a common theme for the UFC in September, but as it sits right now is garbage. It's absolute garbage. It's an embarrassment. If you're not like a real hardcore MMA fan, you can easily skip this card. It really doesn't matter at all. There's no hype behind it. So even if you're going to watch it, there's no hype behind it. And then it's $85 to purchase the pay-per-view. Does anybody actually think this is worth $85? I certainly don't. And then imagine you paid hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to attend this event live. I feel so bad for you if you were an Australian fan who bought tickets for this event, sight unseen, and now you're basically getting scammed out of your money because you're getting this incredibly lackluster card. The UFC could have done better. They should have done better. I'm sure they could have found other fights to put on this card, but now we're 2 weeks out. They can't add nothing to it now. What's crazy is this seems to be a theme for September. UFC 279 last year had like no fights on the card outside of the main event, Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz. And then on 3 weeks' notice, they added Daniel Rodriguez versus Li Jingliang, and they had Daniel Rodriguez versus Kevin Holland and Li Jingliang versus Tony Ferguson. And then those fights all got shifted around. That's why I had trouble recalling them. But they got all shifted around at the end. It still wasn't that great of a card, but they were literally scrambling to add fights on 2 to 3 weeks notice for UFC 279 last September. Sure enough, it was last September. And honestly, imagine if you get hit with another injury. Imagine Strickland has to pull out. I doubt Strickland will pull out, but imagine he has to pull out. Imagine Israel Adesanya has to pull out. Imagine the co-main event falls out. Imagine Tai Tuivasa gets injured. He can't make the fight. Imagine a card, a UFC pay-per-view card in 2023 with Justin Tafa versus Austin Lane as the co-main event. This is unacceptable. They should merge one of these fight night cards with UFC 293 because this card is atrocious. It's absolute garbage, and it's an embarrassment. It is a slap in the face to MMA fans. Let me know what you guys think. Am I overreacting to this card, or do you think it's as bad as I think it is? This makes me, the only thing I like about UFC 293 is I'm going to be so grateful for UFC 294 in late October in Abu Dhabi. What an amazing card that is. So it'll make me grateful for that card. But the fact now we basically go from mid-August to late October without even a good pay-per-view card, that's devastating news for MMA fans. And there's no excitement factor, there's no hype factor for me for UFC 293 at all. But let me know what you guys think. Don't forget to like the video, don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.